Hi all, welcome to our webinar on the off-street parking reforms in Mexico City. This is Michael Kodransky, the Director of Global and US Initiatives, and we are pleased to be hosting this webinar about parking in Mexico City as ITDP has been working on parking globally for the last 10 years. And we have done everything from an analysis on the parking trade-offs along BRT corridors in Ulaanbaatar, the impacts of parking in pedestrian districts in Jakarta, and have worked with governments on creating on-street parking payment systems, and have done occupancy surveys, a host of analysis, as well as shifted into off-street parking regulatory reform, where we see the biggest impact will come for cities in lowering emissions and shifting people out of their cars and into public transit vehicles and into walking and cycling. So as part of our transit-oriented cities program, we see parking is an important lever in shifting cities toward a low carbon paradigm. With us today, we have Bernardo Baranda, who is the Regional Director of ITDP in Latin America and has overseen the parking reform efforts in Latin America, and Andres Sanudo, who used to work for ITDP and was pivotal and critical to the parking reforms in Mexico, and is now helping to spread the word on what it took to make the reforms happen. So with that, I would like to introduce Bernardo and have him present on how they got it done.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone, or good night, wherever you are in the world. So we'll start with the webinar. As you see, the title is Less Parking, More City. I think it translates better in Spanish, but basically the idea is that we want to have better cities with less parking. The content, sorry. Here is the content of the webinar. You can see we'll start with the vision, then we'll talk about the stakeholders mapping, then the key findings of the research, how the policy proposal was made, the importance of the communications, then what was the policy that we were able to pass, and then we'll finalize by talking about the next steps. So just to start, back around in the year 2010, we realized that in order to achieve our goals of reducing emissions, congestion, and building more vibrant communities, we needed to work more intensively on travel demand management. So we decided parking regulation was our best bet to have a significant impact. We began by studying international best practices and eventually produced a research document called Europe's Parking U-Turn from Accommodation to Regulation that was led by Michael Kodransky. So parking reform was framed as a global priority for ITDP, and we began working both with on-street parking regulations and off-street. Besides producing research documents adapted to Mexican and Latin American context, in 2011, we were able to help Mexico City government to plan and implement its first parking meters projects in almost 20 years. On the stakeholders mapping, which is very important, we did a mapping of who we would have to convince and who were our allies, being the most important one, of course, the Mexico City government. This was key to have as much outreach and dialogue with different actors that could push or block a change in parking regulations. You can see that, of course, the government was very important, but also the real estate developers associations and different allies from the civil society. Once there was a change in the Mexico City administration in 2012, we knew we had to start again, but it was also an opportunity to push forward. We were also able to organize a study tour with the British Embassy to learn parking best practices in London, and we took some of the government officials. We produced a very easy to understand infography that you can see in the screen to compare similar developments in Mexico City and London to see how many parking spaces were required and their distance to metro stations. Around 2014, the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing, SEDUVI, asked us to conduct an in-depth study to analyze the current situation of off-street parking in the construction code of the city and a proposal to reform it that was aligned to their general urban development plan objectives. Those objectives included a more compact, sustainable, equitable, and transit-oriented development city. So we made an index of the different things we wanted to study that you can read above. Okay, now I'm gonna pass it to Andres Añudo to go on the research and the key findings of this study.
Thank you, Bernardo, and hello, everyone. Well, as you saw on the previous slide, the research included topics such as an analysis on the current policy, demographics, and general mobility indicators. Obviously, parking supply and demand is, and very important, we did a real estate development trends analysis to see what was happening with parking in the city. And so here I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key findings that we found during the analysis and the study. So first, the complete parking regulation was analyzed. As in many cities, supply and demand for parking is regulated through various instruments, as you can see in this slide, parking garages, urban design, on-street parking, and etc. But the heart of the regulation was found, and as it was expected, in the building code, where the parking minimum requirements were established. This code was responsible of automatically increasing parking supply as long as residential and commercial spaces increased in the city, without any other consideration like location, transport, or a vision in the city's future. The city's parking regulation was based on the usual false assumptions. First, we had a parking supply was understood as a public service, implying, or this implied that the government was responsible of guaranteeing a parking space to every citizen everywhere, and this is not feasible, or sustainable. This severely incentivized oversupplies and underpricing, and therefore driving. So this was, instead of using stricter regulations on parking supply and demand, to reduce car use and the social and environmental impacts that it has. Also, the regulation assumed that there was no relationship between parking demand and transit services, as well as walkable or friendly environments for pedestrians and for cyclists. So the minimum was the same citywide. It was also assumed that there was no relationship between on-street and off-street parking supply. So this was like the usual mistake. So we see that the streets are full, so it should be because there is not enough parking, but it was because of mispricing. Also, the approach of the parking minimums was in a building by building way, without any neighborhood level considerations, and so this also is assuming an infinite road capacity. And the most important is the underlying premise for a minimum regulation is that minimum parking requirements and that parking in itself will mitigate the environmental and traffic impacts of real estate developments. And well, it turns out that it's the opposite. So what does the minimum stated? The Mexico City minimum, as you can see in the slide, it was a very aggressive minimum, requiring like the majority, or well, a very large share of the square meters being built in any land use to be devoted to parking. And this implies not only the square meters that are used for parking, but also the money that has to go and to guarantee a parking space to everyone. We used public information on vehicle ownership by dwelling size. And it turned out that in every case, the parking minimum standard was higher than the vehicle ownership. So this 40-year-old regulation was clearly creating an oversupply. To analyze in more depth this hypothesis, we were able to analyze more than 250 large-scale real estate projects in the city. This effort turned out to be the cornerstone of the research because it gave us like real data of what was happening in the city and where. And so we found out that on average, more than 40% of the square meters built in the city were parking. More than housing, retail, offices, or anything else. We have been basically creating a gigantic garage with some amenities. The vision for the city was to be an infinite parking facility, and we were in the right direction to accomplish it by sacrificing spaces that could have been used for something better. It turned out that not only it was the land use that was built the most, but also the one growing at a faster rate. This is logical. The square meters of any other land use had the obligation to be accompanied by square meters of parking. So imagine that you wanted to develop a rental housing building, then you were obliged to provide parking. But if you wanted to open a parking garage, no one required you to provide housing on top of it. So philosophically, the previous regulation, for the previous regulation and for the city, it used to be more important to create houses for cars than houses for its citizens. Another aspect that we found is that developers were not using the total amount of zoning rights that they could. This was because using all of the allowed leasable area meant the parking supply had to grow proportionally. And so according to the data that we see in the slide and according to interviews with developers, this was not financially possible. So we were sacrificing spaces for housing, for retail, for services, for offices that could have been exploited because just to provide the parking. Then a crucial analysis was the comparison between the minimum and the market. So for every project that we analyzed, we identified the amount of parking provided above the standard as a percentage. So on average, as you can see in the screen, developments had 10% more parking than required. But in reality, this means that they were trying to provide exactly the minimum. First, we have to consider that it was a legal condition. So the only possible way to approximate to the regulations value is from above. You cannot approximate from below because it was illegal. And also, we have to consider the dimension and design restrictions. Take this example. If the minimum used to be 350 parking spaces, but the maximum capacity per floor area, it's 100, then you will build the 400 parking spaces and you will surpass the minimum by 50, which is 14%. So as you can see on the graph, it turns out that most of the developments were close to the minimum regulation, and this was a clear signal that they wanted to build less. Why is that? Well, because we were able to run a hypothesis proof on the relationship between parking demand and the minimum. So the question was, is market demand equal to the minimum? Statistically, we could not reject this hypothesis because, as you can see in the graph, it could be a coincidence that the highest point of the graph that we see here, it was the mean of the market demand curve. But this would mean that whoever created the regulation 40 years ago estimated perfectly the actual demand for parking today. So he or she should deserve a Nobel in economics for such precision. And also we had some interviews with developers and investors, and they were implying that they would build less parking if it was legally possible. So we had to reject this hypothesis of the minimum being equal to demand. Another option was that the minimum is actually lower than the market demand for parking. But this is immediately rejected because there was no legal impediment for developers to provide more parking. So the only limitation was the market itself. If it was not profitable to provide parking, they were not doing it. And if it were profitable, they would do it. But the data was not showing us that. So the only option that was standing, it's that the minimum was higher than the demand for parking. And Mexico City was pushing for an oversupply and therefore for congestion. One way to understand this is using this graph created by Paul Barter. If you want to provide more parking than required, which is the light blue area in the graph, then the minimum is irrelevant for you. But if you want to provide less parking given certain conditions like location, land use, or any market characteristic, then the minimum severely impacts the cost of the development. A way of interpreting this graph with actual data was to compare the percentage of parking above the minimum by project versus the distance to the closest subway station, as you can see in this graph. So let's recall that the minimum was the same everywhere. So the initial thought is that the further away a development is from mass transit, it would provide more parking. But the result is that there is no such linear relation, as you can see in the graph. So we knew that everyone was trying to comply exactly with the minimum. So on average, they wanted to provide less parking. So the majority of the developments in the city are on the dark blue area of the previous graph, and they were being severely impacted by the regulation and passing this impact to the society at large. So the impact on the cost of the development, it also constitutes an opportunity cost of not using those resources to increase sustainable transportation options and quality. So as you can see in this example, parking is a false mitigation of real estate development impacts. We knew that in Mexico City, 1.2 million of square meters of offices were being built in the last 3 years. So this meant if we apply the minimum regulation to those square meters, it meant at least 40,000 parking spaces were being built. And that meant, according to the average cost of a parking space in Mexico City, that was 7 billion Mexican pesos. Just to guarantee a parking space to 40,000 citizens each day and guaranteeing the fuel and the CO2 emissions that come with them. And if we use the same amount of money, we could have built 4 BRT lines of 20 kilometers each at the same cost, and providing more options to citizens. And also the target of that, or the people that were benefited, were more than 500,000. So the design of the initial white paper that was given to Mexico City's government back in 2014, 3 years ago, we have to consider all of the key findings that I have talked about, and also some political stuff. So some of the considerations for the design of the policy. First, we knew that the minimum were above market demand on average. Also, technically, and according to traffic simulations that we ran and the knowledge of the city's road capacity, we knew that the maximum that we wanted to propose had to be lower than the minimum, especially in some areas. And we thought about pushing for parking caps per area. But as you may know, technical viability is not always equal to political viability. So we had to move around something that was feasible to make a reality eventually. It was very important for us to make a 180 degrees turn in the motivation of the law. We had to make parking an impact generator instead of a mitigator. And we knew that the change had to be followed by other changes in different instruments, policies, and programs, so that the complete parking supply and demand policy was comprehensive and coherent. And we also knew that we need a lot of participation and engagement of different sectors for this to become a reality. So the proposal was essentially to change the actual minimum into a maximum. We have been experimenting for more than 40 years, providing parking from the minimum to the infinite, and the results are very visible in our streets and in our cities. So maybe it was time to focus on the other side of the curve, from zero to the previous minimum. That was the reasoning, and also the reasoning had to do with the political viability. It was very important for the change not to be understood as a prohibition on parking. You were still going to be able to have the same amount of parking as before, but it was no longer an obligation, and new markets could be explored, and the city would no longer be required by law to be designed for the automobile. Also, the proposal included a division of the new maximum in groups of 10%, and we proposed a growing fee a structure that for every parking space, the developers would have to pay a certain amount of money, and that money would have to go for transportation improvement investments. In the initial proposal, the first three groups, from 0 to 30% of the maximum, were set at the fee was set at 0, because we wanted to incentivize developers and investors to provide less parking. And then the fee started growing, and the idea was to create an equilibrium around 60 to 70% of the maximum. This meant that the accumulated fee per development would be higher than the savings that a developer would have for not providing the rest of the previous minimum, starting at that point of 60 to 70%. Then, as some of you might have seen in the communication strategy webinar with Veronica Ortiz from ITDP, communication strategy of the findings and of the proposal was paramount. It was a transversal effort along the whole process. All the time we were thinking about different ways of putting the word out. We had the key findings, so that meant that we had a key messages platform that had to be tailored for every different audience. We had a government, society at large, advocacy groups. So we had to the media. So we had to create a key messages platform for each of these groups. One recommendation that I can make is that you have to always talk about it with friends, with colleagues, with stakeholders, with the media, with government, and with your family, with everyone. You have to turn into the boring grandma that always tells the same story. You have to approach the media. This is key. We did workshops with them so that they had a better understanding of this subject, which is, or it might be, very counterintuitive. So we wanted them to know that whenever the policy reform would come out, we wanted the media to know what it was about, and not just go with the flow of talking bad about something. So the communication strategy, as you can see, we had the research and the case study of Mexico City and the analysis, but that would turned out into communications material. That meant infographics, blog post, newspaper, or electronic media. We did a video explaining like the problematic and the possible solutions, and so on. So then it was time for policy delivery to make this a reality. So since 2014, when the white paper was given to the government, there were some opportunities or political windows, if you want to call them that way, for the proposal to become a reality, but they were not exploited for any reason, politics. But also the government teams changed, and this created the need to restart the advocacy efforts But the good side of this was that greater coordination between the urban development and the mobility ministries was generated, and they really saw this as a very important reform, and they started pushing with more strength for it. Also, we were able to create new alliances with think tanks like the IMCO, or with developer groups like Caluz or Reurbano, as you can see in and the ADI, which is a Real Estate Developers Association. And this was starting to give more strength to the movement. And part of these new alliances was that less parking and more city. Now it was not only research and branding for the movement. It turned out into it evolved into a contest. The contest was we invited academics and professionals to rethink parking garages in the city and to propose new uses for this infrastructure. And during the ceremony where the prizes were given, the mayor was invited, and he finally said in public that the regulation would change. So it was the first time that we had him on the record and with the media publicly committed to change the regulation. So this created obviously a lot of traction in the media, local and abroad, as you can see in the slide. A lot of interest in developers groups and investors, because they wanted to participate in the final details and negotiations. So we finally had the traction that we wanted. It was really needed for the mayor to publicly engage with the problematic, and we finally got that, and that created the momentum for the policy to become a reality. So finally, in July 11th of this year, the mayor, Miguel Ángel Mancera of the city, he signed and published the final version of the parking reform. And as you can see here, in this is like the official diary of the city, and in the red circle, there's the new word in town, which is maximum. And well, those of you who speak Spanish will have a better understanding. And then also, well, the main points of the final version. So its minimums were abolished citywide, and also we now have citywide maximums. After the negotiations and the different versions of the reform, the maximum turned out to be a little bit higher than the previous minimum, but it's still a great step forward, because it's no longer an obligation to provide parking. So now you can explore new markets and new strategies for affordable housing and for more compact and dense development. And it's no longer impossible by law. And also the incremental fee per parking space will start at 50% and will grow until the 10%, until 100% of the maximum. And the money will go to mass transit improvements. The specific rules of how the charges will work are, we're still waiting for the government to publish them, but it should be done soon. So what are the next steps? Well, first we need to ensure transparency and efficiency in the process of getting the permits, creating a project, and obviously in terms of the charges and the fee structure, we have to be on top of that. And then we need to have continual monitoring and evaluation of the impacts, so that we can eventually, with time and with data, adjust the maximum and the fee over time. So if the current structure is not giving the better or the best results in terms of urban development and social benefits, then we should move forward by reducing the maximum and also by increasing probably the fee. Also, we need to continue the parking policy reform, because we only changed the building code, but the rest of the regulation that have an influence on parking supply and demand also have to be changed, so that all of the policy is comprehensive and also coherent the different instruments that have an influence on supply and demand for parking. And well, these have to create new synergies with mass transit-oriented development planning and affordable housing and active transportation. And that's it. Thank you very much, and we're open for any questions and participation of the group.
There is a button at the bottom of all of your screens that is called Q&A. Please post your questions there. We have 4 questions so far, and I will ask the questions to Bernardo and Andres, and you can answer them. So there are some questions related to the perception of developers and the cost of building parking. Did the developers think that they could just pass the cost onto the sale value of their spaces, or that they couldn't pass down the cost?
Yeah. Well, one of the obviously developers will pass the sales value to the final customer, which is the citizens. But there are 2 things here. One is that the developments, if they really provide less parking, even though if they pay some of the parking fee, they will be less expensive than previous developments with a lot of parking. So they won't have a lot of cost to pass to the citizens. But even in the cases where they provide a lot of parking, so they have to pay more, like a huge amount of money for transportation improvements. What we have to consider here is that we want them to pass that cost to the consumer, because the consumer is the car user. So that's the way we want to have an influence on car use reduction, by increasing the cost of using a car, and also by creating more money for transportation investments that will be allocated for improvements for the society at large, in having more BRT options or more metro options or bike public bike sharing systems or whatever is considered to be the best.
Should we go on to answer some of the questions, Michael?
Yeah, go ahead. I can ask them to you, or you can just answer.
Yeah,
them.
we can read them. Pamela asked, do they have data about commerce increases, not decreases, when less parking is provided? That's always the myth. I think it's more with, especially, with on-street parking, certainly it's proven that if you have like a more rotation through parking meters or other type of tools, you have more customers that go to your shops. No, but on off-street, yeah, it was difficult for the like shopping mall as an industry because they always design their shopping malls to maximum capacity, to like Christmas and so on. So that was difficult. They were the most difficult ones to convince, but at the end they also understood, especially the smaller ones, no, that they could change those spaces into other uses.
Yeah, and also in terms of the retail industry, we need to consider first, as Bernardo said, that there are different sizes of retail developers, and some of them, they were very enthusiastic about being able to provide less parking, but obviously there were some of them that they were very preoccupied of having parking limited. But what it's important is that the trends in development, and as you can see in the United States, a lot of closures of malls, because the retail industry is changing with online sales and with the automatic automobile, which is like one of the promises for the future. So all of these will impact the retail industry, and we need to be prepared, and our regulations have to be prepared to adopt for this.
Maybe this one, Karina.
Okay, Karina Macias asks from Did Mexico City's planners actively recommend projects near transit to be built with minimum parking supplies, or were developers reacting to the policy and building less? Well, before the change in the regulation, there was no option. Planners, they could promote less parking near transit, but there was nothing legal that they could do about it. Developers had to provide at least the minimum parking. And one of the examples of that is one of the transportation hubs in a very central area of the city. They were going to improve the station and have a real estate project on top of it. And instead of having very little parking, they were providing more than 2,000 parking spaces just in that project that was next to a metro station. And obviously the investors and developers and the city, they wanted to reduce the amount of parking, and now they are able to. And these kind of examples also helped us to create a momentum, because there was a created interest of different sectors to change it.
Also, we have a question about, please suggest some ways of branding. I mean, I think Andres talked about it, but since, I mean, the name that we came up with was catchy in Spanish, so that helped. But also to do the contest, I think that was the best way to do some branding and get the idea into a wider audience. You want to answer this one?
Espectador Anónimo, he asks, or she asks, are there rankings for preferred land uses to replace parking as the parking maximums and associated fees have been adopted? Okay. Well, I guess if I understand the question correctly, I guess the market will start showing us as well, specifically in Mexico City. I wouldn't expect for parking to be replaced by offices, for example, because now we have an oversupply of offices. So it's in the cycle of the real estate office market. It's in a downside. But we have a scarcity of housing, and we have a housing crisis, especially in well-located areas. So we could expect that some of the areas that were used for parking, hopefully they would be used now for creating more houses.
Tiago asked that if the new policy also contemplates bicycle parking. Yes, it does. It has also a minimum that well, in that case, we were able to put a minimum. It wasn't as high as we wanted, with the developers kind of pushed back against it. It was quite ambitious, but now, yeah, they have to have a park in both residential and commercial buildings.
Well, M. Hasimersky asks how this impact on the commercial private garages. And well, it's related with the first question, and the hopefully this will create a better understanding of the market. Now that developers are going to be responsible of deciding how much parking they will provide, instead of being they are giving a recipe of how much parking. Now they are responsible. So this will create a more detailed and better research in terms of market analysis. And they will eventually realize that they don't need as much parking in some of these commercial private garages, and they will use more efficiently land. And also, as you may recall of the presentation, most of the developers, they were not using all of the zoning rights that they had, because they had to provide a lot of parking so now they are going to be able to use all of the leasable area that they are allowed to without increasing the amount of parking. And so we could expect like more incentives for commercial real estate development.
Hugo asked who were the most restrictive stakeholders to the initiative, and what were the retail industry arguments against parking reduction? Well, the retail industry, they were like always saying that they couldn't have, it wasn't good for their business if people couldn't find a parking space. So they were, I think, the most, those were their biggest arguments. Most people, when we would talk about this, they would always kind of agree, but they were always like saying, yeah, I mean, you are going against reducing car use, but we're not Europe. We don't have that great of public transport and arguments like that. No, but in general, I think most people were in favor. No, but they always say, yeah, but we need to have better public transport, even if they never use public transport. No?
And one of the things that is important for this is that the new regulation, it's not a prohibition. You have a maximum, but the maximum is still a little bit above the previous minimum. So if you want to, you can still provide the same amount of parking that they were used to, but now they will have to pay to mitigate the impact of those parking spaces with better transportation options. And hopefully it will be like that. Well, hopefully they won't build as much, and hopefully we won't have any money for transportation investments because they are not building that much parking. But if you do it, then you will have the responsibility to mitigate those impacts for the society. Diego Silva asks, how will the fees be defined per parking space built? And well, the criteria that will be used to monetize this. Well, initially, as I told it during the presentation, we were trying to have an equilibrium around 60 to 70% of the maximum. So whoever built more than that level, the amount of money that development will have to pay will be higher than the savings they will have of not providing the rest of it. So if they provided 80% of the maximum, the money that they will have to pay would be higher than the cost of the 20% remaining. And so this will create an incentive for developers not to concentrate in the higher levels of the maximum, but hopefully in the lower levels. And also this had into consideration the market value of a parking space. And so eventually, as you get closer to the maximum, we want the fee to be higher than the market value of a parking space. But the final rules and prices of this have not been published, and we are pressuring for the government to have a very well and sustained analytical process to define them. But it's a very good question, and hopefully we'll get a very good structure of the parking fee.
Aurora asked, when do you think this parking reform will go to other states of the country? Well, I mean, it's mostly directed to cities. We hope, I mean, Guadalajara has already begun working also on removing minimums in some areas. But it's ongoing challenge to do this in other cities in Mexico, and I would say the region or the world. But I think hopefully this is the beginning of more cities doing this. We're gonna have a conversation later with the Buenos Aires government. So yeah, hopefully also Sao Paulo in Brazil has begun doing interesting things. So yeah, it's something that we want to promote more and certainly help any other city that wants to go in this direction.
Paul Barter asks, hi Paul. You certainly have helped during this process, and he asks, did you get pressure to only abolish the minimums near good transit? And if so, how did you counter that so that the minimums have been abolished everywhere? Well, Yeah, we did, well, not pressure, but some of the people that were working with us, some of them promoted that we had a pilot in some area of the city, like in a very well located area, and that we should start by a small area and testing this. But we were able to counter this by saying some some things that were very well by giving them good information. The thing with the data helped us to tell them that developers were trying to stick to the minimum and not providing more parking in any area of the city, because we had the different developments mapped. So that meant that in any area of the city they wanted to build less. So that's for starters. And then also the thing with a pilot, it's that how much time do you need to evaluate the pilot? This is an urban development and a mobility policy that it's not a short term policy. This will take at least 5 years to have an initial evaluation of the changes, because a small real estate development takes you at least 2 years to be finished, but a large one can take you 5, 7, or 8, or even more, depending on what are you doing. So having very good data about the influence of the change and how it's impacting different neighborhoods, it will take a long time. So what we said was like, well, if we're gonna do it, let's do it for all of the city, given that we know that no one wants to build the minimum. Well, on average, no one wants to build the minimum in any area of the city. So why bother just to do it in an area? And also there is the political process. If you do it only in one area, it's more possible for you to have like complaints from the neighbors, because the neighbors will be like, well, why on my neighborhood? Why did you pick me to try your stuff? No, so well, I hope that answers the question.
Jose Antonio Angles ask, why put more emphasis on the regulation of private space and on the regulation of the road administration in public spaces? Well, we don't think it's one or the other. I mean, they both are important. We always have promoted better sidewalks, better, more bike lanes, BRTs, and the private space. It's very related to the public space. I mean, the congestion affects everyone. When you build a lot of parking, you attract a lot of car trips, and congestion and air quality, it's some of the externalities that we all pay in the public space as a result of the massive car use.
Karina Macias asks, since the adoption of the policy, have any projects with no parking been proposed? If not, would these proposed buildings be required to provide travel demand management features like transit passes for occupants, bike share memberships, etc.? Well, the second part of the question about the travel demand management features or strategies, hopefully they will get into it. This is something that was, it didn't fit into this part of the regulation, but it's part of what when we talk about the making a more comprehensive and coherent parking policy for the city, and not only focusing on the building code, which is where the maximums now are. We hope that these kind of strategies will come out. And the first part of the question, not finalized, but we do know about some developers that are thinking about creating projects with either zero parking or with a lot less than what they used to, especially in some well-located areas with close to transit, but specifically close to economical activity of the city. Ramiro, he asked, did the team identify and analyze the impacts of changing off-street parking standards? On the on-street market, do you anticipate any spillover effects? Well, we don't expect an immediate spillover because since the maximum is close to the minimum, we are expecting that the majority of projects will still include parking, so not much of a spillover in the immediate time, but this will create a very good pressure for the on-street regulation and the parking meter program to be extended and improved around the city, because today the parking meter system, it's like around 25,000 parking spaces in the city, and it should be around 100 or 120,000 parking spaces.
Sharif Razak asked, do you think the parking reform is practicable in automobile-dependent global south cities with deficit of functional transit system? Well, I would say that Mexico is one of those cities, so if it can be done here, I think can be done in other parts. Of course, you have always to brand it and to talk about the need of improving mass transit, certainly, but you cannot just wait for, I mean, it's not one or the other, no? You have to do both. I think you have to restrain car use and also at the same time improve mobility options. Luke Nadal asked, hello Luke, are there parking free or quasi-free projects considered in Mexico City in the model of the London Shard or Gherkin? That means with very little parking, big buildings, that would be great. Not so far as we know, but eventually we think that the market could begin to ask for things like that, especially in very well located areas where the land is very expensive. We foresee that eventually we'll get those type of developments, in very well located areas.
Orena asks, what policies could be adopted in medium-sized cities with real traffic problems, where several sectors of society and government administration still believe that we are a long time away from implementing less parking policies? Well, and this is related to one of the questions that Bernardo just answered. There is no city that has solved the congestion problems by creating more parking. That doesn't exist. So it doesn't matter if you're a small, medium, large-sized city. If you continue to demand more and more and more parking, then you're just making it more difficult for eventually have the transportation system and the public space design that will create a more walkable and cycle and transit-friendly environment. So this should be done hopefully immediately in any city, because there is no value in continuing through this path.
We have time for one more question or two more questions quickly, and then we will need to wrap up, and we will follow up with all of the remaining questions by email.
Thank you, Michael. Christopher Seaman asks, is there a release valve such as a special use permit or something, if a developer wants to build over the maximum? Are there other requirements such as the requiring that structured parking be built so that it can be converted to other use in the future? Well, the only land use that has a release valve or a special use permit is housing. The maximum for housing, it's well, it can be surpassed, but any parking space above that maximum in housing, it will. There are two things. The project has to be only housing. It cannot be a mixed-use project. Actually, in mixed-use projects, the maximum is 70% of the maximum, so the project has to be only housing to be able to surpass the maximum, and each parking space above the maximum will have to pay the higher fee. So we don't expect this to happen very much. It will happen probably in very specific markets of premium residential housing. And it's just the minority of the city and of the project. So we are more focused on creating incentives for affordable housing than for housing for the rich.
Graham Kavanaugh makes a great question. In terms of documenting case studies for monitoring and evaluation, are we collecting information on new developments that have been constructed, such as the new parking maximum policy that has been adopted, to compare their revenue generation and other indicators such as air quality, road safety, etc., to previous examples in order to further gauge success? Yes, I think this is key. We said that the next steps are monitoring and evaluation, but it's a big task. No, I don't think we can do it alone, but we need to certainly monitor and evaluate and to begin having data about the impact of all these indicators, as you mentioned.
And with that, I would like to thank our presenters for explaining some of the nuts and bolts of the parking reform in Mexico City, which we think is a global model, and we hope other cities will follow their example and learn from some of the lessons that they have to share. We will be following up with a link to this webinar. It has been recorded, and all attendees will also receive a copy of the slide deck. So thank you, everyone, for joining. And if you have follow-up questions, please email them to christina.jang@itdp.org. Thank you, and have a good evening, a good morning, or a good afternoon, depending on where you are. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.